Chapter 56 of Pan Michał, an historical novel of Poland, the Ukraine and Turkey by Henryk Sienkiewicz, translated by Jeremiah Curtin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by David Granville Young. Chapter 56. The thunder of cannon shook the castles and the town immediately after the Kindia. The Turks had dug a fosse at the side of the castle, 500 yards long. In one place, at the very wall, they were digging deeply. From that fosse there went against the walls an unceasing fire from janissary muskets. The besieged made screens of leather bags filled with wool, but as long balls and bombs were hurled continually from the entrenchments, bodies fell thickly around the cannon. At one gun, a bomb killed 6 men of Wojciechowski's infantry at once. At other guns, men were falling continually. Before evening, the leaders saw that they could hold out no longer, especially as the mines might be exploded any moment. In the night, therefore, the captains led out their companies, and before morning they had transferred, amid unbroken firing, all the guns, powder, and supplies of provisions to the old castle. That, being built on a rock, could hold out longer, and there was special difficulty in digging under it. Pan Michał, when consulted on this matter at the council, declared that if no one would negotiate, he was ready to defend it a year. His words went to the town and poured great consolation into hearts, for people knew that the little knight would keep his word even at the cost of his life. At the evacuation of the new castle, strong mines were put under both bulwarks and the front. These exploded with great noise about noon, but caused no serious loss to the Turks, for, remembering the lesson of the day before, they had not dared yet to occupy the abandoned place. But both bulwarks, the front, and the main body of the new castle formed one gigantic pile of ruins. These ruins rendered difficult, it is true, approach to the old castle, but they gave perfect protection to sharpshooters, and, what is worse, to the miners who, unterrified at sight of the mighty cliff, began to bore a new mine. Skilful Italian and Hungarian engineers, in the service of the Sultan, were overseers of this work, which advanced rapidly. The besieged could not strike the enemy either from cannon or musket, for they could not see them. Pan Michał was thinking of a sortie, but he could not undertake it immediately. The soldiers were too tired. Blue lumps as large as biscuits had formed on the right shoulders of the dragoons, from bringing gun stocks against them continually. Some could hardly move their arms. It became evident that if boring were continued some time without interruption, the chief gate of the castle would be blown into the air beyond doubt. Foreseeing this, Pan Michał gave command to make a high wall behind the gate, and said, without losing courage, "But what do I care? If the gate is blown up, we will defend ourselves behind the wall. If the wall is blown up, we'll have a second one made previously, and so on, as long as we feel an ell of ground under our feet." "But when the ell is gone, what then?" asked the Starosta. "Then we shall be gone too," said the little knight. Meanwhile he gave command to hurl hand grenades at the enemy. These caused much damage. Most effective in this work was Lieutenant Dembinski, who killed Turks without number until a grenade ignited too soon burst in his hand and tore it off. In this manner perished Captain Schmidt. Many fell from the Turkish artillery, many from musket shots fired by janissaries hidden in the ruins of the new castle. During that time they fired rarely from the guns of the castle. This troubled the council not a little. "They are not firing, hence it is evident that Wojciechowski himself has doubts of the defence." Such was the general opinion. Of the officers, no man dared to say first that it remained only to seek the best conditions, but the bishop, free of military ambition, said this openly. But previously, Pan Waszczykowski was sent to the starosta for news from the castle. He answered, "In my opinion, the castle cannot hold out till evening, but here they think otherwise." After reading this answer, even the officers began to say, "We have done what we could. No one has spared himself, but what is impossible cannot be done. It is necessary to think of conditions." These words reached the town and brought together a great crowd of people. This multitude stood before the town hall, alarmed, silent, rather hostile than inclined to negotiations. Some rich Armenian merchants were glad in their hearts that the siege would be ended and trading begin, but other Armenians, long settled in the Commonwealth and greatly inclined to it, as well as Poles and Russians, wished to defend themselves. "Had we wished to surrender, we should have surrendered at first," was whispered here and there. "We could have received much, but now conditions will not be favourable, and it is better to bury ourselves under ruins." The murmur of discontent became ever louder, till all at once it turned into shouts of enthusiasm and vivats. What had happened? On the square, Pan Michał appeared in company with Pan Humiecki, for the starosta had sent them of purpose to make a report of what had happened in the castle. Enthusiasm seized the crowd. Some shouted as if the Turks had already broken into the town. Tears came to the eyes of others at sight of the idolized knight, on whom uncommon exertions were evident. His face was black from powder smoke, and emaciated. His eyes were red and sunken, but he had a joyous look. When he and Humiecki had made their way at last through the crowd, and entered the council, they were greeted joyously. The bishop spoke at once. "Beloved brothers," said he, "nec Hercules contra plures, the starosta has written us already that you must surrender." To this Humiecki, who was very quick to action and of great family, not caring for people, said sharply, "The starosta has lost his head, but he has this virtue, that he exposes it to danger. As to the defence, let Pan Vodyovski describe it. He is better able to do so." All eyes were turned to the little knight, who was greatly moved, and said, "For God's sake, who speaks of surrender? Have we not sworn to the living gods to fall one upon another?" "We have sworn to do what is in our power, and we have done it," answered the bishop. "Let each man answer for what he has promised. Ketteling and I have sworn not to surrender the castle till death, and we will not surrender. For if I am bound to keep the word of a cavalier to every man, what must I do to God, who surpasses all in majesty?" "But how is it with the castle? We have heard that there is a mine under the gate. Will you hold out long?" asked numerous voices. "There is a mine under the gate, or there will be, but there is a good wall behind the gate, and I have given command to put falconets on it. Dear brothers, fear God's wounds. Remember that in surrendering you will be forced to surrender churches into the hands of pagans, who will turn them into mosques, to celebrate foulness in them. How can you speak of surrender with such a light heart? With what conscience do you think of opening before the enemy a gate to the heart of the country? I am in the castle and fear no mines, and you here in the town, far away, are afraid. By the dear God, we will not surrender while we are alive. Let the memory of this defence remain among those who come after us, like the memory of Zbaraj." "The Turks will turn the castle into a pile of ruins," said some voice. "Let them turn it. We can defend ourselves from a pile of ruins." Here patience failed the little knight somewhat. "And I will defend myself from a pile of ruins, so help me God! Finally, I tell you that I will not surrender the castle. Do you hear?" "But will you destroy the town?" asked the bishop. "If to go against the Turks is to destroy it, I prefer to destroy it. I have taken my oath. I will not waste more words. I will go back among cannon, for they defend the Commonwealth instead of betraying it." Then he went out, and after him Humiecki, who slammed the door. Both hastened greatly, for they felt really better among ruins, corpses, and balls than among men of little faith. Pan Makowiecki came up with them on the way. "Michał," said he, "tell the truth. Did you speak of resistance only to increase courage, or will you be able really to hold out in the castle?" The little knight shrugged his shoulders. "As God is dear to me, let the town not surrender, and I will defend the castle a year." "Why do you not fire? People are alarmed on that account, and talk of surrender." "We do not fire because we are busy with hand grenades, which have caused considerable harm in the mines." "Listen, Michał. Have you in the castle such defence that you could strike at the Russian gate in the rear? For if, which God prevent, the Turks break through, they will come to the gate. I am watching with all my force, but with townspeople only, without soldiers, I cannot succeed." To which the little knight answered, "Fear not, dear brother, I have 15 cannon turned to that side. Be at rest too concerning the castle. Not only shall we defend ourselves, but when necessary we will give you reinforcement at the gates." When he heard this, Makowiecki was delighted greatly, and wished to go away, when the little knight detained him, and asked further, "Tell me, you are oftener at these councils. Do they only wish to try us, or do they intend really to give Kamieniec into the hands of the Sultan?" Makowiecki dropped his head. "Michał," said he, "answer truly now. Must it not end in that? We shall resist a while yet, a week, 2 weeks, a month, 2 months, but the end will be the same." Wołodyjowski looked at him gloomily, then raising his hands cried, "And thou too, Brutus, against me? Well, in that case swallow your shame alone. I am not used to such diet." And they parted with bitterness in their hearts. The mine under the main gate of the old castle exploded soon after Pan Michał's return. Bricks and stones flew, dust and smoke rose, terror dominated the hearts of the gunners. For a while the Turks rushed into the breach, as rush sheep through the open gate of a sheepfold when the shepherd and his assistants urge them in with whips. But Ketling breathed on that crowd with cartridges from 6 cannon, prepared previously on the wall. He breathed once, a second, a third time, and swept them out of the court. Pan Michał, Humiecki, and Myśliszewski hurried up with infantry and dragoons, who covered the walls as quickly as flies on a hot day cover the carcass of a horse or an ox. A struggle began then between muskets and janissary guns. Balls fell on the wall as thickly as falls rain or kernels of wheat which a strong peasant hurls from his shovel. The Turks were swarming in the ruins of the new castle. In every depression, behind every fragment, behind every stone, in every opening of the ruin, they sat in 2s, 3s, 5s, and 10s, and fired without a moment's intermission. From the direction of Chocim came new reinforcements continually. Regiment followed regiment, and, crouching down among the ruins, began fire immediately. The new castle was as if paved with turbans. At times those masses of turbans sprang up suddenly with a terrible outcry and ran to the breach. But then Quetzling raised his voice, the bass of the cannon drowned the rattle of musketry, and a storm of grape shot with whistling and terrible rattling confused the crowd, laid them on the ground, and closed up the breach with a quivering mass of human flesh. 4 times the Janissaries rushed forward. 4 times Quetzling hurled them back and scattered them as a storm scatters a cloud of leaves. Alone amid fire, smoke, showers of earth clods, and bursting grenades, he was like an angel of war. His eyes were fixed on the breach, and on his serene forehead not the slightest anxiety was evident. At times he seized the match from the gunner and touched the priming. At times he covered his eyes with his hand and observed the effect of the shot. At times he turned with a smile to the Polish officers and said, "They will not enter." Never was rage of attack repulsed with such fury of defence. Officers and soldiers vied with one another. It seemed that the attention of those men was turned to everything save death. And death cut down thickly. Pan Humiecki fell, and Pan Mokoszycki, commander of the men of Kiev. At last the white-haired Pan Kałuszowski seized his own breast with a groan. He was an old friend of Pan Michał, as mild as a lamb, but a soldier as terrible as a lion. Pan Michał caught the falling man, who said, give your hand quickly." Then he added, "Praise be to God," and his face grew as white as his beard. That was before the 4th attack. A party of Janissaries had come inside the breach, or rather they could not go out by reason of the 2 thickly flying missiles. Pan Michał sprang on them at the head of his infantry, and they were beaten down in a moment with the butts of muskets. Hour followed hour. The fire did not weaken. But meanwhile news of the heroic defence was borne through the town, exciting enthusiasm and warlike desire. The Polish inhabitants, especially the young men, began to call on one another, to look at one another and give mutual encouragement. "Let us go to the castle with assistance! Let us go! Let us go! We will not let our brothers perish! Come, boys!" Such voices were heard on the square and at the gates. Soon a few hundred men, armed in any fashion, but with daring in their hearts, moved toward the bridge. The Turks turned on the young men a terrible fire, which stretched many dead, but a part passed, and they began to work on the wall against the Turks with great zeal. This 4th attack was repulsed with fearful loss to the Turks, and it seemed that a moment of rest must come. Vain hope! The rattle of Janissary musketry did not cease till evening. Only when the evening Kindu was played did the cannon grow silent and the Turks leave the ruins of the new castle. The remaining officers went then from the wall to the other side. The little knight, without losing a moment, gave command to close up the breach with whatever materials they could find. Hence with blocks of timber, with fascines, with rubbish, with earth. Infantry, cavalry, dragoons, common soldiers and officers vied with one another, regardless of rank. It was thought that Turkish guns might renew fire at any moment, but that was a day of great victory for the besieged over the besiegers. The faces of all the besieged were bright. Their souls were flaming with hope and desire of further victories. Quetzling and Pan Michał, taking each other by the hands after their labour, went around the square and the walls, bent out through the battlements, to look at the courtyard of the new castle, and rejoice at the bountiful harvest. "Body lies there near body," said the little knight, pointing to the ruins. and at the breach there are such piles that you would need a ladder to cross them. That is the work of your cannon, Kettling." "The best thing," answered Kettling, "is that we have repaired that breach. The approach is closed to the Turks, and they must make a new mine. Their power is boundless as the sea, but such a siege for a month or two must become bitter to them. By that time the hetman will help us, but come what may, you and I are bound by oath," said the little knight. At that moment they looked into each other's eyes, and Pan Michał asked in a lower voice, "And have you done what I told you?" "All is ready," whispered Kettling in answer, "but I think it will not come to that, for we may hold out very long here, and have many such days as the present. God grant us such a morrow." "Amen," answered Kettling, raising his eyes to heaven. The thunder of cannon interrupted further conversation. Bombs began to fly against the castle again. Many of them burst in the air, however, and went out like summer lightning. Kettling looked with the eye of a judge. "At that trench over there from which they are firing," said he, "the matches have too much sulphur." "It is beginning to smoke on other trenches," said Volodyovski. And in fact it was, as, when one dog barks in the middle of a still night, others begin to accompany, and at last the whole village is filled with barking, so one cannon in the Turkish trenches roused all the neighbouring guns, and a crown of bombs encircled the besieged place. This time, however, the enemy fired at the town, not the castle, but from 3 sides was heard the piercing of mines. Though the mighty rock had almost baffled the efforts of miners, it was clear that the Turks had determined at all cost to blow that rocky nest into the air. At the command of Kettling and Pan Michał, the defenders began to hurl hand grenades again, guided by the noise of the hammers. But at night it was impossible to know whether that means of defence caused any damage. Besides, all turned their eyes and attention to the town, against which were flying whole flocks of flaming birds. Some missiles burst in the air, but others, describing a fiery circle in the sky, fell on the roofs of houses. At once a reddish conflagration broke the darkness in a number of places. The church of St. Catherine was burning, also the church of St. George in the Russian quarter, and soon the Armenian cathedral was burning. This, however, had been set on fire during the day. It was merely ignited again by the bombs. The fire increased every moment and lighted up all the neighbourhood. The outcry from the town reached the old castle. One might suppose that the whole town was burning. "That is bad," said Kettling, "for courage will fail in the inhabitants." "Let everything burn," said the little knight, "if only the rock is not crushed from which we may defend ourselves." Now the outcry increased. From the cathedral the fire spread to the Armenian storehouses of costly merchandise. These were built on the square belonging to that nationality. Great wealth was burning there in gold, silver, divans, furs, and rich stuffs. After a while, tongues of fire appeared here and there over the houses. Pan Michał was disturbed greatly. "Kettling," said he, "look to the hurling of grenades, and injure work in the mines as much as possible. I will hurry to the town, for my heart is suffering for the Dominican nuns. Praise be to God that the Turks leave the castle in quiet, and that I can be absent." In the castle there was not, in truth, at that moment, much to do. Hence the little knight sat on his horse and rode away. He returned only after 2 hours in company with Pan Mushalski, who, after that injury sustained at the hands of Hamdi Bey, recovered and came now to the fortress, thinking that during storms he might cause notable loss to the pagans and gain glory immeasurable. "Be welcome," said Kettling. "I was alarmed. How is it with the nuns?" "All is well," answered the little knight. "Not one bomb has burst there. The place is very quiet and safe." "Thank God for that. But Krisha is not alarmed?" "She is as quiet as if at home. She and Basha are in one cell, and Pan Zagloba is with them. Pan Adam, to whom consciousness has returned, is here too. He begged to come with me to the castle, but he is not able to stand long on his feet yet. Kettling, go there now, and I will take your place here." Kettling embraced Pan Michał, for his heart drew him greatly to Krisha, and gave command to bring his horse at once. But before they brought the horse, he inquired of the little knight what was to be heard in the town. "The inhabitants are quenching the fire very bravely," answered the little knight. "But when the wealthier Armenian merchants saw their goods burning, they sent deputations to the bishop and insisted on surrender. Hearing of this, I went to the council, though I had promised myself not to go there again. I struck in the face the man who insisted most on surrender. For this the bishop rose in anger against me. The situation is bad, brother. Cowardice is seizing people more and more, and our readiness for defence is for them cheaper and cheaper. They give blame and not praise, for they say that we are exposing the place in vain. I heard, too, that they attacked Makowiecki because he opposed negotiations. The bishop himself said to him, 'We are not deserting faith or king, but what can further resistance effect?' 'See,' said he, 'what will be after it, desecrated shrines, honourable ladies insulted, and innocent children dragged captive. With a treaty,' said he, 'we can assure their fate and obtain free escape.' So spoke the bishop. The starosta nodded and said, 'I would rather perish, but this is true.' 'The will of God be done,' said Kettling. But Pan Michał wrung his hands. 'And if that were even true,' cried he, 'but God is witness that we can defend ourselves yet.' Now they brought Kettling's horse. He mounted quickly. 'Carefully through the bridge,' said Pan Michał at parting, 'for the bombs fall there thickly.' 'I will return in an hour,' said Kettling, and he rode away. Pan Michał started to go around the walls with Mushalski. In 3 places hammering was heard, hence the besieged were throwing hand grenades from 3 places. On the left side of the castle, Lusnia was directing that work. "Well, how is it going with you?" inquired Vodiovsky. "Badly, Pan Commandant," said the sergeant. "The pig-bloods are sitting in the cliff, and only sometimes at the entrance does a piece of shell hurt a man. We haven't done much." In other places the case was still worse, especially as the sky had grown gloomy and rain was falling, from which the wicks in the grenades were growing damp. Darkness, too, hindered the work. Pan Michał drew Mushalski aside somewhat, and halting, said on a sudden, "But listen, if we should try to smother those moles in their burrows?" "That seems to me certain death, for whole regiments of Janissaries are guarding them. But let us try." "Regiments are guarding them, it is true, but the night is very dark, and confusion seizes them quickly. Just think, they are talking of surrender in the town. Why? Because they say to us, 'There are mines under you. You are not defending yourselves.' We should close their lips if tonight we could send the news, 'There is no longer a mine. For such a cause is it worth while to lay down one's head or not?'" Pan Mushalski thought a moment and cried, "It is worth while. As God lives, it is." "In one place they began to hammer not long ago," said Pan Michał. "We will leave those undisturbed, but here and on that side they have dug in very deeply. Take 50 dragoons, I will take the same number, and we will try to smother them. Have you the wish?" "I have, and it is increasing. I will take spikes in my belt to spike cannon. Perhaps on the road I may find some." "As to finding, I doubt that, though there are some falconets standing near. But take the spikes. We will only wait for Ketling. He knows better than others how to succour in a sudden emergency." Ketling came as he had promised. He was not behind time one moment. Half an hour later 2 detachments of dragoons, of 50 men each, went to the breach, slipped out quickly, and vanished in the darkness. Ketling gave command to throw grenades for a short time yet. Then he ceased work and waited. His heart was beating unquietly, for he understood well how desperate the undertaking was. A quarter of an hour passed, half an hour, an hour. It seemed that they ought to be there already and to begin. Meanwhile, putting his ear to the ground, he heard the quiet hammering perfectly. Suddenly, at the foot of the castle, on the left side, there was a pistol shot, which in the damp air, in view of the firing from the trenches, did not make a loud report, and might have passed without rousing the attention of the garrison, had not a terrible uproar succeeded it. "They are there," thought Ketling, "but will they return?" And then sounded the shouts of men, the roar of drums, the whistle of pipes. Finally the rattle of musketry, hurried and very irregular. The Turks fired from all sides and in throngs. Evidently whole divisions had run up to succour the miners. As Pan Michał had foreseen, confusion seized the Janissaries, who, fearing to strike one another, shouted loudly, fired at random, and often in the air. The uproar and firing increased every moment. When martins, eager for blood, break into a sleeping hen house at night, a mighty uproar and cackling rise in the quiet building. Confusion like that set in all at once round the castle. The Turks began to hurl bombs at the walls so as to clear up the darkness. Ketling pointed guns in the direction of the Turkish troops on guard, and answered with grape shot. The Turkish approaches blazed, the walls blazed. In the town the alarm was beaten, for the people believed universally that the Turks had burst into the fortress. In the trenches the Turks thought that a powerful sortie was attacking all their works simultaneously, and a general alarm spread among them. Night favoured the desperate enterprise of Pan Michał and Muszalski, for it had grown very dark. Discharges of cannon and grenades rent only for instants the darkness, which was afterward blacker. Finally the sluices of heaven opened suddenly, and down rushed torrents of rain. Thunder outsounded the firing, rolled, grumbled, howled, and roused terrible echoes in the cliffs. Ketling sprang from the wall, ran at the head of 15 or 20 men to the breach, and waited. But he did not wait long. Soon dark figures swarmed in between the timbers with which the opening was barred. "Who goes there?" cried Ketling. "Volodyovski," was the answer, and the 2 knights fell into each other's embrace. "What? How is it there?" asked the officers, rushing out to the breach. "Praise be to God! The miners are cut down to the last man, their tools are broken and scattered, their work is for nothing. Praise be to God! Praise be to God! But is Muszalski with his men?" "He is not here yet." "We might go to help him. Gracious gentlemen, who is willing?" But that moment the breach was filled again. Muszalski's men were returning in haste, and decreased in number considerably. for many of them had fallen from bullets, but they returned joyously, for with an equally favourable result. Some of the soldiers had brought back hammers, drills, and pickaxes as a proof that they had been in the mine itself. "But where is Mushalski?" asked Pan Michał. "True, where is Pan Mushalski?" repeated a number of voices. The men under command of the celebrated bowmen stared at one another. Then a dragoon, who was wounded severely, said with a weak voice, "Pan Mushalski has fallen. I saw him when he fell. I fell at his side, but I rose, and he remained." The knights were grieved greatly on hearing of the bowman's death, for he was one of the first cavaliers in the armies of the Commonwealth. They asked the dragoon again how it had happened, but he was unable to answer, for blood was flowing from him in a stream, and he fell to the ground like a grain sheaf. The knights began to lament for Pan Mushalski. "His memory will remain in the army," said Pan Kwashibrocki, "and whoever survives the siege will celebrate his name." "There will not be born another such bowman," said a voice. "He was stronger in the arm than any man in Hrebshov," said the little knight. "He could push a thaler with his fingers into a new board. Pan Podbipienta, a Lithuanian, alone surpassed him in strength. But Podbipienta was killed in Zbaraj, and of living men none was so strong in the hands, unless perhaps Pan Adam." "A great, great loss," said others. "Only in old times were such cavaliers born." Thus honouring the memory of the bowman, they mounted the wall. Pan Michał sent a courier at once with news to the starosta and the bishop that the mines were destroyed and the miners cut down by a sortie. This news was received with great astonishment in the town, but, who could expect it, with secret dislike. The starosta and the bishop were of opinion that those passing triumphs would not save Kamieniec, but only rouse the savage lions still more. They could be useful only in case surrender were agreed on in spite of them. Therefore the two leaders determined to continue further negotiations. But neither Pan Michał nor Ketling admitted even for a moment that the happy news could have such an effect. Nay, they felt certain now that courage would enter the weakest hearts, and that all would be inflamed with desire for a passionate resistance. It was impossible to take the town without taking the castle first. Therefore, if the castle not merely resisted but conquered, the besieged had not the least need to negotiate. There was plenty of provisions, also of powder. In view of this, it was only needful to watch the gates and quench fires in the town. During the whole siege, this was the night of most joy for Pan Michał and Ketling. Never had they had such great hope that they would come out alive from those Turkish toils, and also bring out those dearest heads in safety. "A couple of storms more," said the little knight, "and as God is in heaven, the Turks will be sick of them, and will prefer to force us with famine. And we have supplies enough here. September is at hand. In 2 months, rains and cold will begin. Those troops are not over-enduring. Let them get well chilled once, and they will withdraw." "Many of them are from Ethiopian countries," said Ketling, "or from various places where pepper grows, and any frost will nip them. We can hold out 2 months in the worst case, even with storms. It is impossible, too, to suppose that no succour will come to us. The Commonwealth will return to its senses at last, and even if the hetman should not collect a great force, he will annoy the Turk with attacks." "Ketling, as it seems to me, our hour has not struck yet. It is in the power of God, but it seems to me also that it will not come to that. Even if someone has fallen, such as Pan Mushalski, well, there is no help for it. I am terribly sorry for Mushalski, though he died a hero's death. May God grant us no worse one, if only not soon, for I confess to you, Michał, I should be sorry for Krisha. Yes, and I too for Basha. We will work earnestly, and maybe there is mercy above us. I am very glad in soul for some reason. We must do a notable deed tomorrow as well. The Turks have made protections of plank. I have thought of a method used in burning ships. The rags are now steeping in tar, so that tomorrow before noon we will burn all those works. Ah, said the little knight, then I will lead a sortie. During the fire there will be confusion in every case, and it will not enter their heads that there can be a sortie in daylight. Tomorrow may be better than today, Ketling. Thus did they converse with swelling hearts, and then went to rest, for they were greatly wearied. But the little knight had not slept 3 hours when Lusnia roused him. Pan Commandant, said the sergeant, we have news. What is it? Cried the watchful soldier, springing up in one moment. Pan Mushalski is here. For God's sake, what do you tell me? He is here. I was standing at the breach, and heard someone calling from the other side in Polish, "Do not fire, it is I." I looked. There was Pan Mushalski coming back, dressed as a janissary. Praise be to God, said the little knight, and he sprang up to greet the bowman. It was dawning already. Pan Mushalski was standing outside the wall in a white cap and armour, so much like a real janissary that one's eyes were slow in belief. Seeing the little knight, he hurried to him and began to greet him joyously. "We have mourned over you already," cried Volodyovski. With that, a number of other officers ran up, among them Ketling. All were amazed beyond description, and interrupted one another, asking how he came to be in Turkish disguise. "I stumbled," said he, "over the body of a janissary when I was returning, and struck my head against a cannon-ball. Though I had a cap bound with wire, I lost consciousness at once. My head was tender after that blow which I got from Hamdi Bey. When I came to myself, I was lying on a dead janissary as on a bed. I felt my head. It was a trifle sore, but there was not even a lump on it. I took off my cap. The rain cooled my head, and I thought, 'This is well for us. It would be a good plan to take that janissary's uniform and stroll among the Turks. I speak their tongue as well as Polish, and no one could discover me by my speech. My face is not different from that of a janissary. I will go and listen to their talk.' Fear seized me at times, for I remembered my former captivity, but I went. The night was dark. There was barely a light here and there. I tell you, gentlemen, I went among them as if they had been my own people. Many of them were lying in trenches under cover. I went to them. This and that one asked, 'Why are you strolling about?' 'Because I cannot sleep,' answered I. Others were talking in crowds about the siege. There is great consternation. I heard with my own ears how they complained of our Hrepchev commandant here present." At this, Pan Mushalski bowed to Volodyovski. "I repeat the ipsissima verba, very words, because an enemy's blame is the highest praise. 'While that little dog,' said they, thus did the dog brothers call your grace, 'while that little dog defends the castle, we shall not capture it.' Others said, 'Bullets and iron do not harm him, but death blows from him as from a pestilence.' Then all in the crowd began to complain. 'We alone fight,' said they, 'and other troops are doing nothing. The volunteers are lying with their bellies to the sky. The Tartars are plundering, the Spahis are strolling about the bazaars. The Padishah says to us, 'My dear lambs,' but it is clear that we are not over dear to him, since he sends us here to the shambles. 'We will hold out,' said they, 'but not long. Then we will go back to Hotchim, and if they do not let us go, some lofty heads may fall.'" "Do you hear, gracious gentlemen," cried Volodyovski, "when the Janissaries mutiny, the Sultan will be frightened and raise the siege." "As God is dear to me, I tell the pure truth," said Mushalski. "Rebellion is easy among the Janissaries, and they are very much dissatisfied. I think that they will try 1 or 2 storms more, and then will gnash their teeth at their Aga, the Kaima Khan, or even the Sultan himself." "So it will be," cried the officers. "Let them try 12 storms, we are ready," said others. They rattled their sabres and looked with bloodshot eyes at the trenches, while drawing deep breaths. Hearing this, the little knight whispered with enthusiasm to Ketling, "A news barrage, a news barrage." But Pan Mushalski began again. "I have told you what I heard. I was sorry to leave them, for I might have heard more, but I was afraid that daylight might catch me. I went then to those trenches from which they were not firing. I did this so as to slip by in the dark. I see no regular sentries, only groups of Janissaries strolling as everywhere. I go to a frowning gun. No one says anything. You know that I took spikes for the cannon. I push a spike into the priming quickly. It won't go in. It needs a blow from a hammer. But since the Lord God gave some strength to my hand, you have seen my experiments more than once, I pressed the spike. It squeaked a little, but went into the head. I was terribly glad." "As God lives, did you do that? Did you spike the great cannon?" asked men on every side. "I spiked that and another, for the work went so easily that I was sorry to leave it, and I went to another gun. My hand is a little sore, but the spike went in." "Gracious gentlemen," cried Pan Michał, "no one here has done greater things, no one has covered himself with such glory. Vivat Pan Mushalski!" "Vivat, vivat!" repeated the officers. After the officers, the soldiers began to shout. The Turks in their trenches heard those shouts and were alarmed. Their courage fell the more. But the bowman, full of joy, bowed to the officers, and showed his mighty palm, which was like a shovel. On it were 2 blue spots. "True as God lives, you have the witness here," said he. "We believe," cried all. "Praise be to God that you came back in safety." "I passed through the planking," continued the bowman. "I wanted to burn that work, but I had nothing to do with it." "Do you know, Michał," cried Ketling, "my rags are ready. I am beginning to think of that planking. Let them know that we attack first." "Begin, begin," cried Pan Michał. He rushed himself to the arsenal, and sent fresh news to the town. "Pan Mushalski was not killed in the sortie, for he has returned, after spiking 2 heavy guns. He was among the Janissaries, who think of rebelling. In an hour we shall burn their woodworks, and if it be possible to make at the same time a sortie, I will make it." The messenger had not crossed the bridge when the walls were trembling from the roar of cannon. This time the castle began the thundering dialogue. In the pale light of the morning the flaming rags flew like blazing banners and fell on the woodwork. The moisture with which the night rain had covered the wood helped nothing. Soon the timbers caught fire and were burning. After the rags, Ketling hurled bombs. The wearied crowds of Janissaries left the trenches in the first moments. They did not play the Kindia. The vizier himself appeared at the head of new legions, but evidently doubt had crept even into his heart, for the pashas heard how he muttered, "Battle is sweeter to those men than sleep. What kind of people live in that castle?" In the army were heard on all sides alarmed voices repeating, "The little dog is beginning to bite. The little dog is beginning to bite." End of chapter 56. Chapter 57 of Pan Michał, an historical novel of Poland, the Ukraine and Turkey, by Henryk Sienkiewicz. Translated by Jeremiah Curtin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by David Granville Young. Chapter 57. That happy night, full of omens of victory, was followed by August 26, the day most important in the history of that war. In the castle they expected some great effort on the part of the Turks. In fact, about sunrise there was heard such a loud and mighty hammering along the left side of the castle as never before. Evidently the Turks were hurrying with a new mine, the largest of all. Strong detachments of troops were guarding that work from a distance. Swarms began to move in the trenches. From the multitude of coloured banners, with which the field on the side of Dłużek had bloomed as with flowers, it was known that the vizier was coming to direct the storm in person. New cannon were brought to the entrenchments by janissaries, countless throngs of whom covered the new castle, taking refuge in its fosses and ruins, so as to be in readiness for a hand-to-hand struggle. As has been said, the castle was the first to begin the converse with cannon, and so effectually that a momentary panic rose in the trenches. But the Bimbashes rallied the janissaries in the twinkle of an eye. At the same time, all the Turkish cannon raised their voices. Bombs, balls, and grape shot were flying. At the heads of the besieged flew rubbish, bricks, plaster. Smoke was mingled with dust, the heat of fire with the heat of the sun. Breath was failing in men's breasts, sight left their eyes. The roar of guns, the bursting of bombs, the biting of cannon balls on the rocks, the uproar of the Turks, the cries of the defenders, formed one terrible concert, which was accompanied by the echoes of the cliffs. The castle was covered with missiles. The town, the gates, all the bastions were covered. But the castle defended itself with rage. It answered thunders with thunders, shook, flashed, smoked, roared, vomited fire, death, and destruction, as if Jove's anger had borne it away, as if it had forgotten itself amid flames, as if it wished to drown the Turkish thunders and sink in the earth, or else triumph. In the castle, among flying balls, fire, dust, and smoke, the little knight rushed from cannon to cannon, from one wall to another, from corner to corner. He was like a destroying flame. He seemed to double and treble himself. He was everywhere. He encouraged, he shouted. When a gunner fell, he took his place, and, rousing confidence in men, ran again to some other spot. His fire was communicated to the soldiers. They believed that this was the last storm, after which would come peace and glory. Faith in victory filled their breasts. Their hearts grew firm and resolute. The madness of battle seized their minds. Shouts and challenges issued every moment from their throats. Such rage seized some that they went over the wall to close outside with the janissaries hand to hand. The janissaries, under cover of smoke, went twice to the breach in dense masses, and twice they fell back in disorder after they had covered the ground with their bodies. About midday, The volunteer and irregular Janissaries were sent to aid them, but the less trained crowds, though pushed from behind with darts, only howled with dreadful voices and did not wish to go against the castle. The Kaimakan came. That did no good. Every moment threatened disorder bordering on panic. At last the men were withdrawn, and the guns alone worked unceasingly as before, hurling thunder after thunder, lightning after lightning. Whole hours were spent in this manner. The sun had passed the zenith, and rayless, red and smoky, as if veiled by haze, looked at that struggle. About 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the roar of guns gained such force that in the castle the loudest words shouted in the ear were not audible. The air in the castle became as hot as in a stove. The water which they poured on the cannon turned into steam, mixing with the smoke and hiding the light, but the guns thundered on. Just after 3 o'clock, the largest Turkish culverines were broken. Some hour farthers later, the mortar standing near them burst, struck by a long shot. Gunners perished like flies. Every moment it became more evident that irrepressible castle was gaining in the struggle, that it would roar down the Turkish thunder and utter the last word of victory. The Turkish fire began to weaken gradually. "The end will come," shouted Volodyovski with all his might in Kettling's ear. He wished his friend to hear those words amid the roar. "So I think," answered Kettling. "To last till tomorrow, or longer?" "Perhaps longer. Victory is with us today. And through us we must think of that new mine." The Turkish fire was weakening still more. "Keep up the cannonade," cried Volodyovski, and he sprang among the gunners. "Fire, men," cried he, "till the last Turkish gun is silent, to the glory of God and the Most Holy Lady, to the glory of the Commonwealth." The soldiers, seeing that the storm was nearing its end, gave forth a loud shout, and with the greater enthusiasm fired at the Turkish trenches. "We'll play an evening Kindia for you, dog brothers," cried many voices. Suddenly something wonderful took place. All the Turkish guns ceased at once, as if someone had cut them off with a knife. At the same time, the musketry fire of the Janissaries ceased in the new castle. The old castle thundered for a time yet, but at last the officers began to look at one another and inquire, "What is this? What has happened?" Kettling, alarmed somewhat, ceased firing also. "Maybe there is a mine under us which will be exploded right away," said one of the officers. Volodyovski pierced the man with a threatening glance and said, "The mine is not ready, and even if it were, only the left side of the castle could be blown up by it, and we will defend ourselves in the ruins while there is breath in our nostrils. Do you understand?" Silence followed, unbroken by a shot from the trenches or the town. After thunders from which the walls and the earth had been quivering, there was something solemn in that silence, but something ominous also. The eyes of each were intent on the trenches, but through the clouds of smoke nothing was visible. Suddenly the measured blows of hammers were heard on the left side. "I told you that they are only making the mine," said Pan Michał. "Sergeant, take 20 men and examine for me the new castle," commanded he, turning to Lusnia. Lusnia obeyed quickly, took 20 men, and vanished in a moment beyond the breach. Silence followed again, broken only by groans here and there, or the gasp of the dying and the pounding of hammers. They waited rather long. At last the sergeant returned. "Pan Commandant," said he, "there is not a living soul in the new castle." Volodyovski looked with astonishment at Ketling. "Have they raised the siege already, or what? Nothing can be seen through the smoke." But the smoke, blown by the wind, became thin, and at last its veil was broken above the town. At the same moment a voice, shrill and terrible, began to shout from the bastion, "Over the gates are white flags! We are surrendering!" Hearing this, the soldiers and officers turned toward the town. Terrible amazement was reflected on their faces. The words died on the lips of all, and through the strips of smoke they were gazing toward the town. But in the town, on the Russian and Polish gates, white flags were really waving. Farther on, they saw one on the bastion of Batory. The face of the little knight became as white as those flags waving in the wind. "Ketling, do you see?" whispered he, turning to his friend. Ketling's face was pale also. "I see," replied he. And they looked into each other's eyes for some time, uttering with them everything which two soldiers like them, without fear or reproach, had to say. Soldiers who never in life had broken their word, and who had sworn before the altar to die rather than surrender the castle. And now, after such a defence, after a struggle which recalled the days of Zbaraj, after a storm which had been repulsed, and after a victory, they were commanded to break their oath, to surrender the castle, and live. As, not long before, hostile balls were flying over the castle, so now hostile thoughts were flying in a throng through their heads, and sorrow simply measureless pressed their hearts. Sorrow for two loved ones, sorrow for life and happiness. Hence they looked at each other as if demented, as if dead, and at times they turned glances full of despair toward the town, as if wishing to be sure that their eyes were not deceiving them, to be sure that the last hour had struck. At that time horses' hoofs sounded from the direction of the town, and after a while Horaim, the attendant of the Starosta, rushed up to them. "An order to the commandant," cried he, reining in his horse. Volodyovski took the order, read it in silence, and, after a time, amid silence as of the grave, said to the officers, "Gracious gentlemen, commissioners have crossed the river in a boat and have gone to Dwójek to sign conditions. After a time they will come here. Before evening we must withdraw the troops from the castle and raise a white flag without delay." No one answered a word. Nothing was heard but quick breathing. At last Kwashibrocki said, "We must raise the white flag. I will muster the men." Here and there the words of command were heard. The soldiers began to take their places in ranks and shoulder arms. The clatter of muskets and the measured tread roused echoes in the silent castle. Ketling pushed up to Pan Michał. "Is it time?" inquired he. "Wait for the commissioners. Let us hear the conditions. Besides, I will go down myself." "No, I will go. I know the places better. I know the position of everything." "The commissioners are returning! The commissioners are returning!" The three unhappy envoys appeared in the castle after a certain time. They were Gruszecki, judge of Podole, the chamberlain Rzewuski, and Pan Myśliszewski, banneret of Chernichov. They came gloomily, with drooping heads. On their shoulders were gleaming kaftans of gold brocade, which they had received as gifts from the vizier. Volodyovski was waiting for them, resting against a gun turned toward Dwójek. The gun was hot yet and steaming. All three greeted him in silence. "What are the conditions?" asked he. "The town will not be plundered. Life and property are assured to the inhabitants. Whoever does not choose to remain has the right to withdraw and betake himself to whatever place may please him." "And Kamieniec?" The commissioners dropped their heads. "Goes to the Sultan forever." The commissioners took their way, not toward the bridge, for throngs of people had blocked the road, but toward the southern gate at the side. When they had descended, they sat in the boat which was to go to the Polish gate. In the low place lying along the river between the cliffs, the Janissaries began to appear. Greater and greater streams of people flowed from the town and occupied the place opposite the old bridge. Many wished to run to the castle, but the outgoing regiments restrained them, at command of the little knight. When Volodyovski had mustered the troops, he called Pan Mushalski and said to him, "Old friend, do me one more service. Go this moment to my wife and tell her from me—" Here the voice stuck in the throat of the little knight for a while. "And say to her from me—" He halted again, and then added quickly, "This life is nothing." The bowman departed. After him the troops went out gradually. Pan Michał mounted his horse and watched over the march. The castle was evacuated slowly because of the rubbish and fragments which blocked the way. Ketling approached the little knight. "I will go down," said he, fixing his teeth. "Go, but delay till the troops have marched out. Go." Here they seized each other in an embrace which lasted some time. The eyes of both were gleaming with an uncommon radiance. Ketling rushed away at last toward the vaults. Pan Michał took the helmet from his head. He looked a while yet on the ruin, on that field of his glory, on the rubbish, the corpses, the fragments of walls, on the breastwork, on the guns. Then, raising his eyes, he began to pray. His last words were, "Grant her, O Lord, to endure this patiently. Give her peace." Ah, Ketling hastened, not waiting even till the troops had marched out, for at that moment the bastions quivered, an awful roar rent the air. Bastions, towers, walls, horses, guns, living men, corpses, masses of earth, all torn upward with a flame, and mixed, pounded together as it were, into one dreadful cartridge, flew toward the sky. Thus died Volodyovski, the Hector of Kamieniec, the first soldier of the Commonwealth. In the monastery of St. Stanisław stood a lofty catafalque in the center of the church. It was surrounded with gleaming tapers, and on it lay Pan Volodyovski in two coffins, one of lead and one of wood. The lids had been fastened, and the funeral service was just ending. It was the heartfelt wish of the widow that the body should rest in Hrebczów, but since all Podole was in the hands of the enemy, it was decided to bury it temporarily in Stanisław, for to that place the exiles of Kamieniec had been sent under a Turkish convoy, and there delivered to the troops of the hetman. All the bells in the monastery were ringing. The church was filled with a throng of nobles and soldiers who wished to look for the last time at the coffin of the Hector of Kamieniec and the first cavalier of the Commonwealth. It was whispered that the hetman himself was to come to the funeral, but as he had not appeared so far, and as at any moment the Tartars might come in a chambul, it was determined not to defer the ceremony. Old soldiers, friends, or subordinates of the deceased stood in a circle around the catafalque. Among others were present Pan Muszalski, the bowman, Pan Motowidło, Pan Snitko, Pan Chromyka, Pan Jenieszyniec, Pan Nowowiejski, and many others, former officers of the stanitsa. By a marvellous fortune, no man was lacking of those who had sat on the evening benches around the hearth at Khrepshov. All had brought their heads safely out of that war, except the man who was their leader and model. That good and just knight, terrible to the enemy, loving to his own, that swordsman above swordsmen, with the heart of a dove, lay there high among the tapers, in glory immeasurable, but in the silence of death. Hearts, hardened through war, were crushed with sorrow at that sight. Yellow gleams from the tapers shone on the stern, suffering faces of warriors, and were reflected in glittering points in the tears dropping down from their eyelids. Within the circle of soldiers lay Basha, in the form of a cross, on the floor, and near her Zagloba, old, broken, decrepit, and trembling. She had followed on foot from Kamieniec the hearse bearing that most precious coffin, and now the moment had come when it was necessary to give that coffin to the earth. Walking the whole way, insensible, as if not belonging to this world, and now at the catafalque, she repeated with unconscious lips, "This life is nothing." She repeated it because that beloved one had commanded her, for that was the last message which he had sent her. But in that repetition and in those expressions were mere sounds, without substance, without truth, without meaning and solace. No, this life is nothing meant merely regret, darkness, despair, torpor, merely misfortune incurable, life beaten and broken, an erroneous announcement that there was nothing above her, neither mercy nor hope, that there was merely a desert, and it will be a desert which God alone can fill when he sends death. They rang the bells. At the great altar Mass was at its end. At last thundered the deep voice of the priest, as if calling from the abyss, "Requiescat in pace." A feverish quiver shook Basha, and in her unconscious head rose one thought alone, now they will take him from me. But that was not yet the end of the ceremony. The knights had prepared many speeches to be spoken at the lowering of the coffin. Meanwhile, Father Kaminski ascended the pulpit, the same who had been in Khrepshov frequently, and who in time of Basha's illness had prepared her for death. People in the church began to spit and cough, as is usual before preaching. Then they were quiet, and all eyes were turned to the pulpit. The rattling of a drum was heard on the pulpit. The hearers were astonished. Father Kaminski beat the drum as if for alarm. He stopped suddenly, and a death-like silence followed. Then the drum was heard a second and a third time. Suddenly the priest threw the drumsticks to the floor of the church and called, "Pan Colonel Volodyovski!" A spasmodic scream from Basha answered him. It became simply terrible in the church. Pan Zagloba rose, and, aided by Muszalski, bore out the fainting woman. Meanwhile the priest continued, "In God's name, Pan Volodyovski, they are beating the alarm. There is war. The enemy is in the land. And do you not spring up, seize your sabre, mount your horse? Have you forgotten your former virtue? Do you leave us alone with sorrow, with alarm?" The breasts of the knights rose, and a universal weeping broke out in the church, and broke out several times again when the priest lauded the virtue, the love of country, and the bravery of the dead man. His own words carried the preacher away. His face became pale, his forehead was covered with sweat, his voice trembled. Sorrow for the little knight carried him away, sorrow for Kamieniec, sorrow for the Commonwealth, ruined by the hands of the followers of the Crescent. And finally, he finished his eulogy with this prayer: "O Lord, they will turn churches into mosques, and chant the Koran in places where till this time the gospel has been chanted. Thou hast cast us down, O Lord, thou hast turned thy face from us, and given us into the power of the foul Turk. Inscrutable are thy decrees, but who, O Lord, will resist the Turk now? What armies will war with him on the boundaries? Thou, from whom nothing in the world is concealed, thou knowest best that there is nothing superior to our cavalry. What cavalry can move for thee, O Lord, as ours can? Wilt thou set aside defenders behind whose shoulders all Christendom might glorify thy name? O kind Father, do not desert us. Show us thy mercy. Send us a defender. Send a crusher of the foul Mohammedan. Let him come hither. Let him stand among us. Let him raise our fallen hearts. Send him, O Lord." At that moment the people gave way at the door, and into the church walked the hetman, Pan Sobieski. The eyes of all were turned to him. A quiver shook the people, and he went with clatter of spurs to the catafalque, lordly, mighty, with the face of a Caesar. An escort of iron cavalry followed him. "Salvator!" cried the priest in prophetic ecstasy. Sobieski knelt at the catafalque and prayed for the soul of Volodyovski. End of chapter 57. Epilogue of Pan Michał, an historical novel of Poland, the Ukraine, and Turkey, by Henryk Sienkiewicz. Translated by Jeremiah Curtow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by David Granville Young. Epilogue. More than a year after the fall of Kamieniec, when the dissensions of parties had ceased in some fashion, the Commonwealth came forth at last in defence of its eastern boundaries, and it came forth offensively. The Grand Hetman Sobieski marched with 31,000 cavalry and infantry to Chocim in the Sultan's territory, to strike on the incomparably more powerful legions of Husein Pasha stationed at that fortress. The name of Sobieski had become terrible to the enemy. During the year succeeding the capture of Kamieniec, the hetman accomplished so much, injured the countless army of the Padishah to such a degree, crushed out so many chambuls, rescued such throngs of captives, that old Husein, though stronger in the number of his men, though standing at the head of chosen cavalry, though aided by Kaplan Pasha, did not dare to meet the hetman in the open field, and decided to defend himself in a fortified camp. The hetman surrounded that camp with his army, and it was known universally that he intended to take it in an offensive battle. Some thought surely that it was an undertaking unheard of in the history of war to attack a superior with an inferior army when the enemy was protected by walls and trenches. Husein had 120 guns, while in the whole Polish camp there were only 50. The Turkish infantry was threefold greater in number than the power of the hetman. Of Janissaries alone, so terrible in hand-to-hand conflict, there were 80,000. But the hetman believed in his star, in the magic of his name, and finally in the men whom he led. Under him marched regiments trained and tempered in fire, men who had grown up from years of childhood in the bustle of war, who had passed through an uncounted number of expeditions, campaigns, sieges, battles. Many of them remembered the terrible days of Khmelnytsky, of Zbaraj and Berestetska. Many had gone through all the wars, Swedish, Prussian, Muscovite, Civil, Danish, and Hungarian. With him were the escorts of magnates, formed of veterans only. There were soldiers from the stanitsas, for whom war had become what peace is for other men, the ordinary condition and course of life. Under the voyevoda of Rus were 15 squadrons of hussars, cavalry considered, even by foreigners, as invincible. There were light squadrons, the very same at the head of which the hetman had inflicted such disasters on detached Tartar chambuls after the fall of Kamieniec. There were finally the land infantry, who rushed on Janissaries with the butts of their muskets without firing a shot. War had reared those veterans, for it had reared whole generations in the Commonwealth, but hitherto they had been scattered or in the service of opposing parties. Now, when internal agreement had summoned them to one camp and one command, the hetman hoped to crush with such soldiers the stronger Hussein and the equally strong Kaplan. These old soldiers were led by trained men whose names were written more than once in the history of recent wars, in the changing wheel of defeats and victories. The hetman himself stood at the head of them all like a sun, and directed thousands with his will. But who were the other leaders who at this camp in Chocim were to cover themselves with immortal glory? There were the 2 Lithuanian hetmans, the Grand Hetman Pats, and the Field Hetman Michał Kazimierz Radziwiłł. These 2 joined the armies of the kingdom a few days before the battle, and now, at command of Sobieski, they took position on the heights which connected Chocim with Żwaniec. 12,000 warriors obeyed their commands. Among these were 2,000 chosen infantry. From the Dniester toward the south stood the allied regiments of Wallachia, who left the Turkish camp on the eve of the battle to join their strength with Christians. At the flank of the Wallachians stood with his artillery Pan Konski, incomparable in the capture of fortified places, in the making of entrenchments, and the handling of cannon. He had trained himself in foreign countries, but soon excelled even foreigners. Behind Konski stood Korycki's Russian and Mazovian infantry. Farther on, the field hetman of the kingdom, Dmitry Vishniovetzky, cousin of the sickly king. He had under him the light cavalry. Next to him, with his own squadron of infantry and cavalry, stood Pan Jędrzej Potocki, once an opponent of the hetman, now an admirer of his greatness. Behind him and behind Korycki stood, under Pan Jabłonowski, voyevoda of Rus, 15 squadrons of hussars in glittering armour, with helmets casting a threatening shade on their faces, and with wings at their shoulders. A forest of lances reared their points above these squadrons, but the men were calm. They were confident in their invincible force, and sure that it would come to them to decide the victory. There were warriors inferior to these, not in bravery, but in prominence. There was Pan Wójecki, whose brother the Turks had slain in Bodzanów. For this deed he had sworn undying vengeance. there was Pan Stefan Charniecki, nephew of the great Stefan, and field secretary of the kingdom. He, in time of the siege of Kamieniec, had been at the head of a whole band of nobles at Golemb as a partisan of the king, and had almost roused civil war. Now he desired to distinguish himself with bravery. There was Gabriel Szilnicki, who had passed all his life in war, and age had already whitened his head. There were other voyevodas and castellans, less acquainted with previous wars, less famous, but therefore more greedy of glory. Among the knighthood not clothed with senatorial dignity, illustrious above others was Pan Jan, the famous hero of Zbaraj, a soldier held up as a model to the knighthood. He had taken part in every war fought by the Commonwealth during 30 years. His hair was grey, but 6 sons surrounded him, in strength like 6 wild boars. Of these, 4 knew war already, but the 2 younger had to pass their novitiate. Hence they were burning with such eagerness for battle that their father was forced to restrain them with words of advice. The officers looked with great respect on this father and his sons, but still greater admiration was roused by Pan Yarotzki, who, blind of both eyes, like the Bohemian King Jan, joined the campaign. He had neither children nor relatives. Attendants led him by the arms. He hoped for no more than to lay down his life in battle, benefit his country, and win glory. There too was Pan Rzeszicki, whose father and brother fell during that year. There also was Pan Motovidło, who had escaped not long before from Tartar bondage, and gone to the field with Pan Myśliszewski. The first wished to avenge his captivity. The second, the injustice which he had suffered at Kamieniec, where, in spite of the treaty and his dignity of noble, he had been beaten with sticks by the Janissaries. There were knights of long experience from the stanitsas of the Dniester. The wild Pan Ruszczyk and the incomparable bowman Muszalski, who had brought a sound head out of Kamieniec, because the little knight had sent him to Basha with a message. There was Pan Snitko and Pan Nieniesziniec and Pan Chromycha, and the most unhappy of all, young Pan Adam. Even his friends and relatives wished death to this man, for there remained no consolation for him. When he had regained his health, Pan Adam exterminated Chambuls for a whole year, pursuing Lithuanian Tartars with special animosity. After the defeat of Pan Motovidło by Kryczynski, he hunted Kryczynski through all Podole, gave him no rest, and troubled him beyond measure. During those expeditions he caught Adurowicz and flayed him alive. He spared no prisoners, but found no relief for his suffering. A month before the battle he joined Jabłonowski's hussars. This was the knighthood with which Pan Sobieski took his position at Chocim. Those soldiers were eager to wreak vengeance for the wrongs of the Commonwealth in the first instance, but also for their own. In continual battles with the pagans in that land soaked in blood, almost every man had lost some dear one, and bore within him the memory of some terrible misfortune. The Grand Hetman hastened to battle then, for he saw that rage in the hearts of his soldiers might be compared to the rage of a lioness, whose whelps reckless hunters have stolen from the thicket. On November 9, 1674, the affair was begun by skirmishes. Crowds of Turks issued from behind the walls in the morning. Crowds of Polish knights hastened to meet them with eagerness. Men fell on both sides, but with greater loss to the Turks. Only a few Turks of note or Poles fell, however. Pan May, in the very beginning of the skirmish, was pierced by the curved sabre of a gigantic Spahi, but the youngest son of Pan Yan with one blow almost severed the head from that Spahi. By this deed he earned the praise of his prudent father and notable glory. They fought in groups or singly. Those who were looking at the struggle gained courage. Greater eagerness rose in them each moment. Meanwhile, detachments of the army were disposed around the Turkish camp, each in the place pointed out by the hetman. Pan Sobieski, taking his position on the old Yassi road, behind the infantry of Koretsky, embraced with his eyes the whole camp of Husssein, and on his face he had the serene calmness which a master certain of his art has before he commences his labour. From time to time he sent adjutants with commands. Then, with thoughtful glance, he looked at the struggle of the skirmishers. Toward evening, Pan Jabłonovski, voevoda of Rus, came to him. "The entrenchments are so extensive," said he, "that it is impossible to attack from all sides simultaneously. Tomorrow we shall be in the entrenchments, and after tomorrow we shall cut down those men in 3/4 of an hour," said Sobieski calmly. Night came in the meanwhile. Skirmishers left the field. The hetman commanded all divisions to approach the entrenchments in the darkness. This Husssein hindered as much as he could with guns of large calibre, but without result. Toward morning the Polish divisions moved forward again somewhat. The infantry began to throw up breastworks. Some regiments had pushed on to within a good musket shot. The Janissaries opened a brisk fire from muskets. At command of the hetman, almost no answer was given to these volleys, but the infantry prepared for an attack hand to hand. The soldiers were waiting only for the signal to rush forward passionately. Over their extended line flew grape-shot with whistling and noise like flocks of birds. Pan Konski's artillery, beginning the conflict at daybreak, did not cease for one moment. Only when the battle was over did it appear what great destruction its missiles had wrought, falling in places covered most thickly with the tents of Janissaries and Spahis. Thus passed the time until midday. But since the day was short, as the month was November, there was need of haste. On a sudden all the trumpets were heard, and drums, great and small. Tens of thousands of throats shouted in one voice. The infantry, supported by light cavalry advancing near them, rushed in a dense throng to the onset. They attacked the Turks at 5 points simultaneously. Jan Denmark and Christopher de Bohan, warriors of experience, led the foreign regiments. The first, fiery by nature, hurried forward so eagerly that he reached the entrenchment before others, and came near destroying his regiment, for he had to meet a salvo from several thousand muskets. He fell himself. His soldiers began to waver, but at that moment de Bohan came to the rescue and prevented a panic. With a step as steady as if on parade, and keeping time to the music, he passed the whole distance to the Turkish entrenchment, answered salvo with salvo, and when the fosse was filled with fascines, passed it first under a storm of bullets, inclined his cap to the Janissaries, and pierced the first banneret with a sabre. The soldiers, carried away by the example of such a colonel, sprang forward, and then began dreadful struggles, in which discipline and training vied with the wild valour of the Janissaries. But dragoons were led quickly from the direction of Taraban by Tetwin and Dönhoff. Another regiment was led by Aswer Greben and Hedepol, all distinguished soldiers who, except Hedepol, had covered themselves with great glory under Charniecki in Denmark. The troops of their command were large and sturdy, selected from men on the royal domains, well trained to fighting on foot and on horseback. The gate was defended against them by irregular janissaries, who, though their number was great, were thrown into confusion quickly and began to retreat. When they came to hand conflict, they defended themselves only when they could not find a place of escape. That gate was captured first, and through it cavalry went first to the interior of the camp. At the head of the Polish land infantry, Kobyłecki, Żebrowski, Piotrkowczyk, and Gałecki struck the entrenchments in 3 other places. The most tremendous struggle raged at the main gate on the Yassy road, where the Mazovians closed with the guard of Husein Pasha. The vizier was concerned mainly with that gate, for through it the Polish cavalry might rush to the camp. Hence he resolved to defend it most stubbornly, and urged forward unceasingly detachments of janissaries. The land infantry took the gate at a blow, and then strained all their strength to retain it. Cannon balls and a storm of bullets from small arms pushed them back. From clouds of smoke, new bands of Turkish warriors sprang forth to the attack every moment. Pan Kobyłecki, not waiting till they came, rushed at them like a raging bear, and 2 walls of men pressed each other, swaying backward and forward in close quarters, in confusion, in a whirl, in torrents of blood, and on piles of human bodies. They fought with every manner of weapon, with sabres, with knives, with gunstocks, with shovels, with clubs, with stones. The crush became at moments so great, so terrible, that men grappled and fought with fists and with teeth. Husein tried twice to break the infantry with the impact of cavalry, but the infantry fell upon him each time with such extraordinary resolution that the cavalry had to withdraw in disorder. Pan Sobieski took pity at last on his men, and sent all the camp servants to help them. At the head of these was Pan Notovidło. This rabble, not employed usually in battle, and armed with weapons of any kind, rushed forward with such desire that they roused admiration even in the hetman. It may be that greed of plunder inspired them. Perhaps the fire seized them which enlivened the whole army that day. It is enough that they struck the janissaries as if they had been smoke, and overpowered them so savagely that in the first onset they forced them back a musket shot's length from the gate. Husein threw new regiments into the whirl of battle, and the struggle, renewed in the twinkle of an eye, lasted whole hours. At last Korecki, at the head of chosen regiments, beset the gate in force. The hussars from a distance moved like a great bird raising itself lazily to flight, and pushed toward the gate also. At this time an adjutant rushed to the hetman from the eastern side of the camp. "The voyevoda of Bielsk is on the ramparts," cried he, with panting breast. After him came a second. "The hetmans of Lithuania are on the ramparts." After him came others, always with similar news. It had grown dark in the world, but light was beaming from the face of the hetman. He turned to Pan Bijinski, who at that moment was near him, and said, "Next comes the turn of the cavalry, but that will be in the morning." No one in the Polish or the Turkish army knew or imagined that the hetman intended to defer the general attack till the following morning. Nay, adjutants sprang to the captains with the command to be ready at any instant. The infantry stood in closed ranks. Sabres and lances were burning the hands of the cavalry. All were awaiting the order impatiently, for the men were chilled and hungry. But no order came. Meanwhile, hours passed. The night became as black as morning. Drizzling rain had set in at 1 o'clock in the day, but about midnight a strong wind with frozen rain and snow followed. Gusts of it froze the marrow in men's bones. The horses were barely able to stand in their places. Men were benumbed. The sharpest frost, if dry, could not be so bitter as that wind and snow, which cut like a scourge. In constant expectation of the signal, it was not possible to think of eating and drinking, or of kindling fires. The weather became more terrible each hour. That was a memorable night, a night of torture and gnashing of teeth. The voices of the captains, "Stand, stand," were heard every moment, and the soldiers, trained to obedience, stood in the greatest readiness without movement and patiently. But in front of them, in rain, storm, and darkness, stood in equal readiness the stiffened regiments of the Turks. Among them, too, no one kindled a fire, no one ate, no one drank. The attack of all the Polish forces might come at any moment. Therefore the Spahis could not drop their sabres from their hands. The Janissaries stood like a wall, with their muskets ready to fire. The hardy Polish soldiers, accustomed to the sternness of winter, could pass such a night, but those men reared in the mild climate of Roumelia, or amid the palms of Asia Minor, were suffering more than their powers could endure. At last Hussein discovered why Sobieski did not begin the attack. It was because that frozen rain was the best ally of the Poles. Clearly, if the Spahis and Janissaries were to stand through 12 hours like those, the cold would lay them down on the morrow as grain sheaves are laid. They would not even try to defend themselves, at least till the heat of the battle should warm them. Both Poles and Tartars understood this. About 4 o'clock in the morning, 2 pashas came to Hussein, Yanish Pasha and Kiaya Pasha, the leader of the Janissaries, an old warrior of renown and experience. The faces of both were full of anxiety and care. "Lord," said Kiaya first, "if my lambs stand in this way till daylight, neither bullets nor swords will be needed against them." "Lord," said Yanish Pasha, "my Spahis will freeze and will not fight in the morning." Hussein twisted his beard, foreseeing defeat for his army and destruction to himself. But what was he to do? Were he to let his men break ranks for even a minute, or let them kindle fires to warm themselves with hot food, the attack would begin immediately. As it was, the trumpets were sounded at intervals near the ramparts, as if the cavalry were just ready to move. Kiaya and Yanish Pasha saw only one escape from disaster. That was, not to wait for the attack, but to strike with all force on the enemy. It was nothing that he was in readiness, for though ready to attack, he did not expect attack himself. Perhaps they might drive him out of the entrenchments. In the worst event, defeat was likely in a night battle. In the battle of the morrow it was certain. But Hussein did not venture to follow the advice of the old warriors. "How," said he, "you have furrowed the campground with ditches, seeing in them the one safeguard against that hellish cavalry. That was your advice and your precaution. Now you say something different." He did not give that order. He merely gave an order to fire from cannon, to which Pan Konski answered with great effect instantly. The rain became colder and colder, and cut more and more cruelly. The wind roared, howled, went through clothing and skin, and froze the blood in men's veins. So passed that long November night, in which the strength of the warriors of Islam was failing, and despair, with a foreboding of defeat, seized hold of their hearts. At the very dawn, Yanish Pasha went once more to Hussein with advice to withdraw in order of battle to the bridge on the Dniester, and begin there the game of war cautiously. For, said he, if the troops do not withstand the onrush of the cavalry, they will withdraw to the opposite bank, and the river will give them protection. Kyaia, the leader of the Janissaries, was of another opinion, however. He thought it too late for Yanish's advice, and, moreover, he feared lest a panic might seize the whole army immediately if the order were given to withdraw. The Spahis, with the aid of the irregular Janissaries, must sustain the first shock of the enemy's cavalry, even if all are to perish in doing so. By that time the Janissaries will come to their aid, and when the first impetus of the unbelievers is stopped, perhaps God may send victory. Thus advised, Kyaia and Hussein followed. Mounted multitudes of Turks pushed forward. The Janissaries, regular and irregular, were disposed behind them around the tents of Hussein. Their deep ranks presented a splendid and fear-inspiring spectacle. The white-bearded Kyaia, Lion of God, who till that time had led only to victory, flew past their close ranks, strengthening them, raising their courage, reminding them of past battles and their own unbroken preponderance. To them also battle was sweeter than that idle waiting in storm and in rain, in wind which was piercing them to the bone. Hence, though they could barely grasp the muskets and spears in their stiffened hands, they were still cheered by the thought that they would warm them in battle. With far less desire did the Spahis await the attack, because on them was to fall its first fury, because among them were many inhabitants of Asia Minor and of Egypt, who, exceedingly sensitive to cold, were only half living after that night. The horses also suffered not a little, and though covered with splendid caparisons, they stood with heads toward the earth, puffing rolls of steam from their nostrils. The men with blue faces and dull eyes did not even think of victory. They were thinking only that death would be better than torment like that in which the last night had been passed by them, but best of all would be flight to their distant homes beneath the hot rays of the sun. Among the Polish troops, a number of men without sufficient clothing had died before day on the ramparts. In general, however, they endured the cold far better than the Turks, for the hope of victory strengthened them, and a faith almost blind that, since the hetman had decided that they were to stiffen in the rain, the torment must come out infallibly for their good, and for the evil and destruction of the Turks. Still, even they greeted the first gleams of that morning with gladness. At this same time, Sobieski appeared at the battlements. There was no brightness in the sky, but there was brightness on his face, for when he saw that the enemy intended to give battle in the camp, he was certain that that day would bring dreadful defeat to Mohammed. Hence he went from regiment to regiment, repeating, "For the desecration of churches, for blasphemy against the most holy lady in Kamieniec, for injury to Christendom and the Commonwealth, for Kamieniec." The soldiers had a terrible look on their faces, as if wishing to say, "We can barely restrain ourselves. Let us go, Grand Hetman, and you will see." The grey light of morning grew clearer and clearer. Out of the fog, rows of horses' heads, forms of men, lances, banners, finally regiments of infantry, emerged more distinctly each moment. First, they began to move and advance in the fog toward the enemy, like two rivers at the flanks of the cavalry. Then the light horse moved, leaving only a broad road in the middle, over which the hussars were to rush when the right moment came. Every leader of a regiment in the infantry, every captain, had instructions and knew what to do. Pan Konski's artillery began to speak more profoundly, calling out from the Turkish side also strong answers. Then musketry fire thundered, a mighty shout was heard throughout the whole camp. The attack had begun. The misty air veiled the view, but sounds of the struggle reached the place where the hussars were in waiting. The rattle of arms could be heard, and the shouting of men. The hetman, who till then had remained with the hussars, and was conversing with Pan Jabłonovski, stopped on a sudden and listened. "The infantry are fighting with the irregular Janissaries. Those in the front trenches are scattered," said he to the voyevoda. After a time, when the sound of musketry was failing, one mighty salvo roared up on a sudden. After it another very quickly. It was evident that the light squadrons had pushed back the Spahis and were in presence of the Janissaries. The Grand Hetman, putting spurs to his horse, rushed like lightning at the head of some tens of men to the battle. The voyevoda of Rus remained with the 15 squadrons of hussars, who, standing in order, were waiting only for the signal to spring forward and decide the fate of the struggle. They waited long enough after that, but meanwhile in the depth of the camp it was seething and roaring more and more terribly. The battle seemed at times to roll on to the right, then to the left, now toward the Lithuanian armies, now toward the voyevoda of Bielsk, precisely as when, in time of storm, thunders roll over the sky. The artillery fire of the Turks was becoming irregular, while Pan Konski's batteries played with redoubled vigour. After the course of an hour, it seemed to the voyevoda of Rus that the weight of the battle was transferred to the centre, directly in front of his cavalry. At that moment the Grand Hetman rushed up at the head of his escort. Flame was shooting from his eyes. He reined in his horse near the voyevoda of Rus and exclaimed, "At them now, with God's aid!" "At them!" shouted the voyevoda of Rus, and after him the captains repeated the commands. With a terrible noise that forest of lances dropped with one movement toward the heads of the horses, and 15 squadrons of that cavalry accustomed to crush everything before it moved forward like a giant cloud. From the time when, in the 3 days' battle at Warsaw, the Lithuanian hussars, under Prince Połubinski, split the whole Swedish army like a wedge, and went through it, no one remembered an attack made with such power. Those squadrons started at a trot, but at a distance of 200 paces the captains commanded, "At a gallop!" The men answering with a shout, "Strike! Crush!" bent in the saddles, and the horses went at the highest speed. Then that column, moving like a whirlwind, and formed of horses, iron men, and straightened lances, had in it something like the might of an element let loose, and it went like a storm or a raging river, with roar and outburst. The earth groaned under the weight of it, and if no man had levelled a lance or drawn a sabre, it was evident that the hussars, with their very weight and impact, would hurl down, trample, and break everything before them, just as a column of wind breaks and crushes a forest. They swept on in this way to the bloody field, covered with bodies, on which the battle was raging. The light squadrons were still struggling on the wings with the Turkish cavalry, which they had succeeded in pushing to the rear considerably, but in the centre the deep ranks of the Janissaries stood like an indestructible wall. A number of times the light squadrons had broken themselves against that wall, as a wave rolling on breaks itself against a rocky shore. To crush and destroy it was now the task of the hussars. A number of thousands of muskets thundered, as if one man had fired. A moment more, the Janissaries fixed themselves more firmly on their feet. Some blink at sight of the terrible onrush. The hands of some are trembling while holding their spears. The hearts of all are beating like hammers. Their teeth are set. Their breasts are breathing convulsively. The hussars are just on them. The thundering breath of the horses is heard. Destruction, annihilation, death are flying at them. Allah! Jesus! Mary! These two shouts meet and mingle as terribly as if they had never burst from men's breasts till that moment. The living wall trembles, bends, breaks. The dry crash of broken lances drowns for a time every other sound. After that is heard the bite of iron, the sound, as it were, of thousands of hammers beating with full force on anvils, as of thousands of flails on a floor, and cries singly and collectively, groans, shouts, reports of pistols and guns, the howling of terror. Attackers and attacked mingle together, rolling in an unimaginable whirl. A slaughter follows. From under the chaos blood flows, warm, steaming, filling the air with raw odour. The 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 10th rank of the Janissaries are lying like a pavement, trampled with hoofs, pierced with spears, cut with swords. But the white-bearded Kyaia, lion of God, hurls all his men into the boiling of the battle. It is nothing that they are put down like grain before a storm. They fight. Rage seizes them. They breathe death. They desire death. The column of horses' breasts pushes them, bends, overturns them. They open the bellies of horses with their knives. Thousands of sabres cut them without rest. Blades rise like lightning and fall on their heads, shoulders, and hands. They cut a horseman on the legs, on the knees. They wind around and bite like venomous worms. They perish and avenge themselves. Kyaia, lion of God, hurls new ranks again and again into the jaws of death. He encourages them to battle with a cry, and with curved sabre erect he rushes into the chaos himself. With that, a gigantic hussar, destroying like a flame everything before him, falls on the white-bearded old man, and, standing in his stirrups to hew the more terribly, brings down with an awful sweep a two-handed sword on the grey head. Neither the sabre nor the headpiece, forged in Damascus, are proof against the blow, and Kyaia, cleft almost to the shoulders, falls to the ground as if struck by lightning. Pan Adam, for it was he, had already spread dreadful destruction, for no one could withstand the strength and sullen rage of the man. But now he had given the greatest service by hewing down the old hero, who alone had supported the stubborn battle. The Janissaries shouted in a terrible voice on seeing the death of their leader, and more than 10 of them aimed muskets at the breast of the cavalier. He turned toward them like dark night, and before other hussars could strike them, the shots roared. Pan Adam reined in his horse and bent in the saddle. 2 comrades seized him by the shoulders, but a smile, a guest long unknown, lighted his gloomy face. His eyeballs turned in his head, and his white lips whispered words which in the din of battle no man could distinguish. Meanwhile, the last ranks of the Janissaries wavered. The valiant János Pasha tried to renew the battle, but the terror of panic had seized on his men. Efforts were useless. The ranks were broken and shivered, pushed back, beaten, trampled, slashed. They could not come to order. At last they burst, as an overstrained chain bursts, and like single links men flew from one another in every direction, howling, shouting, throwing down their weapons and covering their heads with their hands. The cavalry pursue them, and they, not finding space sufficient for flight singly, gather at times into a dense mass, on whose shoulders ride the cavalry, swimming in blood. Pan Mushalski, the bowman, struck the valiant János Pasha such a sabre blow on the neck that his spinal marrow gushed forth and stained his silk shirt and the silver scales on his armour. The irregular Janissaries, beaten by the Polish infantry, and a part of the cavalry which was scattered in the very beginning of the battle, in fact, a whole Turkish throng, fled now to the opposite side of the camp, where there was a rugged ravine some tens of feet deep. Terror drove the madmen to that place. Many rushed over the precipice, not to escape death, but death at the hands of the Poles. Pan Bijinski blocked the road to this despairing throng, but the avalanche of fugitives tore him away with it and threw him to the bottom of the precipice, which, after a time, was filled almost to the top with piles of slain, wounded, and suffocated men. From this place rose terrible groans. Bodies were quivering, kicking one another, or clawing with their fingers in the spasms of death. Those groans were heard until evening. Until evening those bodies were moving, but more and more slowly, less and less noticeably, till at dark there was silence. Awful were the results of the blow of the hussars. 8,000 Janissaries, slain with swords, lay near the ditch surrounding the tents of Husein Pasha, not counting those who perished in the flight or at the foot of the precipice. The Polish cavalry were in the tents. Pan Sobieski had triumphed. The trumpets were raising the hoarse sounds of victory when the battle raged up again on a sudden. After the breaking of the Janissaries, the vizier, Husein Pasha, at the head of his mounted guards and of all that were left of the cavalry, fled through the gate leading to Jassy. But when the squadrons of Dmitri Vishniovetzky, the field hetman, caught him outside and began to hew without mercy, he turned back to the camp to seek escape elsewhere, just as a wild beast surrounded in a forest looks for some outlet. He turned with such speed that he scattered in a moment the light squadron of Cossacks, put to disorder the infantry, occupied partly in plundering the camp, and came within half a pistol shot of the hetman himself. "In the very camp," wrote Pan Sobieski afterward, "we were near defeat, the avoidance of which should be ascribed to the extraordinary resolution of the hussars. In fact, the pressure of the Turks was tremendous, produced as it was under the influence of utter despair, and the more terrible that it was entirely unexpected. But the hussars, not cooled yet after the heat of battle, rushed at them on the spot with the greatest vigour. Krushinovsky's squadron moved first, and that brought the attackers to a stand. After it rushed Pan Yan with his men. Then the whole army, cavalry, infantry, camp followers, every one as he was, every one where he was, all rushed with the greatest rage on the enemy, and there was a battle, somewhat disordered, but not yielding in fury to the attack of the hussars on the Janissaries. When the struggle was over, the knights remembered with wonder the bravery of the Turks who, attacked by Vishniovetzky and the hetmans of Lithuania, surrounded on all sides, defended themselves so madly that though Sobieski permitted the Poles to take prisoners then, they were able to seize barely a handful of captives. When the heavy squadrons scattered them at last, after half an hour's battle, single groups and later single horsemen fought to the last breath, shouting, "Allah!" Many glorious deeds were done, the memory of which has not perished among men. The field hetman of Lithuania cut down a powerful pasha who had slain Pan Rudamina, Pan Kimba, and Pan Rudotovsky. But the hetman, coming to him unobserved, cut off his head at a blow. Pan Sobieski slew in presence of the army a Spahi who had fired a pistol at him. Pan Bijinski, escaping from the ravine by some miracle, though bruised and wounded, threw himself at once into the world of battle and fought till he fainted from exhaustion. He was sick long, but after some months recovered his health and went again to the field, with great glory to himself. Of men less known, Pan Ruszczyk raged most, taking off horsemen as a wolf seizes sheep from a flock. Pan Yan, on his part, worked wonders. Around him his sons fought like young lions. With sadness and gloom did these knights think afterward of what that swordman above swordsmen, Pan Michał, would have done on such a day, were it not that for a year he had been in the earth, resting in God and in glory. But others, taught in his school, gained sufficient renown for him and themselves on that bloody field. 2 of the old knights of Chrzebów fell in that renewed battle, Pan Motovidło and the terrible bowman Muszalski. A number of balls pierced the breast of Motovidło simultaneously, and he fell as an oak falls which has come to its time. Eye-witnesses said that he fell by the hand of those Cossack brothers who, under the lead of Hohol, had struggled to the last against their mother, Poland, and Christendom. Pan Muszalski, wonderful to relate, perished by an arrow which some fleeing Turk had sent after him. It passed through his throat just in the moment when, at the perfect defeat of the pagans, he was reaching his hand to the quiver to send fresh, unerring messengers of death in pursuit of the fugitives. But his soul had to join the soul of Didyuk, so that the friendship begun on the Turkish galley might endure with the bonds of eternity. The old comrades of Chrzebów found the 3 bodies after the battle, and took farewell tearfully, though they envied them the glorious death. Pan Adam had a smile on his lips, and calm serenity on his face. Pan Motovidło seemed to be sleeping quietly, and Pan Muszalski had his eyes raised as if in prayer. They were buried together on that glorious field of Chocim, under the cliff on which, to the eternal memory of the day, their 3 names were cut out beneath a cross. The leader of the whole Turkish army, Hussein Pasha, escaped on a swift Anatolian steed, but only to receive in Stamboul a silk string from the hands of the Sultan. Of the splendid Turkish army, merely small bands were able to bear away sound heads from defeat. The last legions of Hussein Pasha's cavalry gave themselves into the hands of the armies of the Commonwealth. In this way the field hetman drove them to the grand hetman, and he drove them to the Lithuanian hetmans, they again to the field hetman. So the turn went, till nearly all of them had perished. Of the Janissaries almost no man escaped. The whole immense camp was streaming with blood, mixed with snow and rain. So many bodies were lying there that only frost, ravens, and wolves prevented a pestilence which comes usually from bodies decaying. The Polish troops fell into such ardour of battle that, without drawing breath, well after the victory, they captured Chocim. In the camp itself immense booty was taken. 120 guns, and with them 300 flags and banners, did Pan Sobieski take from that field, on which, for the second time in the course of a century, the Polish sabre celebrated a grand triumph. Pan Sobieski himself stood in the tent of Husein Pasha, which was sparkling with rubies and gold, and from it he sent news of the fortunate victory to every side by swift couriers. Then cavalry and infantry assembled. All the squadrons, Polish, Lithuanian, and Cossack, the whole army, stood in order of battle. A Thanksgiving Mass was celebrated, and on that same square where the day previous muezzins had cried La Allah ila Allah, was sounded Te Deum Laudamus. The hetman, lying in the form of a cross, heard Mass and the hymn, and when he rose, tears of joy were flowing down his worthy face. At sight of that, the legions of knights, the blood not yet wiped from them, and while still trembling from their efforts in battle, gave out 3 times the loud thundering shout, Vivat Joannes Victor! 10 years later, when the majesty of King Jan III, Sobieski, hurled to the dust the Turkish power at Vienna, that shout was repeated from sea to sea, from mountain to mountain, throughout the world, wherever bells called the faithful to prayer. Here ends this series of books, written in the course of a number of years and with no little toil, for the strengthening of hearts. End of Epilogue. End of Pan Michał, an historical novel of Poland, the Ukraine, and Turkey, by Henryk Sienkiewicz, translated by Jeremiah Curtin.